what we have seen is that when we were analyzing athletes of all people, lean, normal body weight, highly active athletes, we were seeing that some of these athletes on high carbohydrate diets were developing prediabetes, up to 30%. And what we found is that when they reduced carbohydrates, they were able to eliminate all blood glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. So they resolved their prediabetes glucose levels almost immediately. And when we were trying to understand, okay, what is driving that? Which is to your question. What is driving this adverse change? Well, I reached out to other researchers. We pulled all our data. I was looking at various biomarkers that was associated with these rising glucose levels. We were seeing in arguably the people we thought were immune to these type of conditions, Jesse. And what we found was that it wasn't their body mass index or an index of their body composition. It wasn't that. I thought that was definitely going to come out as a signal. It didn't. It also wasn't necessarily age. Age was only a very small factor. It was associated with it, but it was a very small factor because as we get older, we suspect glucose levels would be more at risk for being elevated due to insulin resistance as we age. But that wasn't it. It wasn't fitness level in the concept of a biomarker of VO2 max, which is your maximal aerobic capacity, a measure of fitness. The amount of carbohydrates that these athletes were consuming during the day was the strongest predictor, explained over 30% of the rising blood glucose levels we were seeing in these athletes. So what people were consuming during the day in the form of carbohydrates was actually predicting the changes they were seeing when they weren't eating. Do we know why that is? No. We don't know why carbohydrate intakes during the day are causing, in this case, individuals that we thought would be immune to these adverse health consequences from the food environment to develop elevated glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. We never thought that'd be the case. And nor did I suspect that the carbohydrate intake they were consuming, because when you look at what they were consuming wasn't necessarily unhealthy. It was completely aligned with the sports nutrition guidelines for athletes today. Completely aligned with it. Average carbohydrate intake was slightly above 350 grams per day. Okay? These individuals were very fit, high VO2 max active athletes, but they had prediabetes glucose levels. And they resolved it by reducing the amount of carbohydrates in the diet while keeping activity, body composition, and calories consistent. So it was just a change in the macronutrients. So that then lends a theory, not a proven one, but a theory that the amount of carbohydrates being consumed in the diet for some individuals, again, I only said 30% of athletes, I didn't say 100%, were developing glucose levels consistent with prediabetes as carbohydrates started to elevate. And I will tell you, for most people in the nutrition world, dietetics world, exercise physiology world, their mind would blow up thinking like, oh, carbohydrates are causing diabetes. No, they're not. Then why was it linked? Why? Why was it linked? The body composition in those athletes that had prediabetes wasn't higher. Their fat wasn't higher. Their fitness level wasn't uniquely higher or lower. They weren't that much older or younger. They were right in the middle of the cohort. Nothing else explained it. Now, we didn't have all their biomarkers. We didn't have their genetic background, which could have been a risk factor. We didn't have a lot of things, but we had some pretty important signals that we know are associated with it. And it did pop out that carbohydrates were the strongest predictor of elevation in blood glucose levels during the fasted state. So that lends a theory that these type of foods are causing some individuals to develop prediabetes. In fact, we've seen that at the top end of elite athletics. We've seen individuals, prior Ironman champions getting diabetes, largely explained, at least through their own lived experience anecdotally, from their diet. Because keep in mind, some of these athletes, according to sports nutrition guidelines, and honestly, if you look at the prior dietary guidelines of America, they're all pushing very high carbohydrate intakes. Now, I'm not just going to sit here and tell you that carbs are evil. In fact, some of our research shows that carbs can improve performance, but it's not about carbs being evil. It's about the precise dose of them to be aligned with the physiology and mechanisms we know drive the changes people want to see. That's it. It's about being precise. It's not about a universal blanket statement that they are good or evil. That's not true. They are a tool, just like anything, and the amount matters. So back to your original point, when we talk about things that may put someone, let's say, at risk, or things that they could look at, or things that they could monitor to adjust, I think people could look at the various biomarkers we spoke about. But one of the things that's emerging is the dietary choice that people are making, because not only can it resolve the issue, but now we're having evidence that it's associated with the incidence of adverse outcomes in metabolic health, even in people we thought would be immune to it.
Okay, to make sure I understand this correctly, these athletes are consuming carbs. They are performing, so utilizing more energy, assuming than the average person, but fasting blood glucose was still elevated because of the carbs they're taking in.
So if I were to say very blanket statement, layman response, I would say generally, yes, that is what we observe, but there's some nuance there. So we don't know the carbs cause the elevation in blood glucose levels. What we know is that when people reduce the carbohydrates, it resolved the elevations in pre-diabetic glucose levels. We also know that when we looked across 7 different analyses in athletes who are wearing these continuous every 5-minute monitors of their blood glucose to get a high resolution on their glucose levels, that the strongest predictor of rising glucose levels when they weren't eating, which is the basal metabolic state, so the fasted state, which is where people look at to see if there's changes in your metabolism, absent of other factors, we were seeing that carbohydrate intake was the strongest predictor of that. So this is, again, illustrating a consistent theme that higher carbohydrate intake is, one, when you reduce it, it eliminates. 2, it's linked more than any other biomarker that we were able to assess to the rising glucose levels. And we know that physiologically speaking, that if you consume more carbohydrates, your blood sugar elevates, your insulin elevates. And then again, if you do that in excess, that there's problems that arise. But again, these athletes weren't doing it in excess. They didn't gain any weight. They were lean the entire time. Their activity was controlled. Their calories were controlled the entire time. And their body weight was controlled. And they still developed prediabetes just from a macronutrient shift. So what we're illustrating here is not necessarily a causal A to B relationship, but a very consistent kind of central and consistent theme that, yeah, what you're choosing when you consume a diet can have a pretty powerful impact. But to support that theme was one of these major analyses from Duke and researchers in the United States and China, 34 or 36 different countries, over 4,000 different subjects, had really refined assessments on nutrition, energy expenditure, using these techniques called deuterium labeled water. And what they were finding is they were trying to understand what was the cause of the obesity epidemic. Was it, the diet, a lack of activity, or something else? What they found is that the diet explained over 90% of the obesity epidemic observed across various parts of the globe. So yes, it does seem that the diet is driving things like obesity. We know that diet can be a contributor or linked very strongly to diseases that can be reversed by lifestyle, like diabetes. So that's a more nuanced way of describing to your audience that in the general terms, if someone were to take something away from this, they may take away exactly what you said. But it's also important to illustrate where we actually stand with some of the information and data so that when people are exposed to new information, they're able to assimilate that more accurately, because they'll probably hear me say something, they hear someone else say something and say, well, they're just saying 2 different things. It's like, well, no, take the nuance of what I said, and hopefully the other person, they gave some nuance as well. And you can put all those pieces together to come up with a better puzzle and a better solution to what's happening.
When these athletes were on the carbs, they weren't fat overall. Do we know if they were gaining visceral fat?
Well, so the study was over a 4-week period. So almost certainly they wouldn't have, and their body weight didn't change. So it'd be very unlikely that they would have had a massive shift in the type of fat they were consuming. Because keep in mind, their inherent diet they were consuming before they started the study was a high carbohydrate diet to begin with. So they were already consuming on average a high carbohydrate based diet. And so we didn't dramatically shift those athletes away from that when they went onto that diet, but it was a pretty profound shift when they went onto the ketogenic diet, right? So very unlikely that it was associated with visceral fat. But to be fair, we didn't do like an MRI scan, but it would have been unlikely that was the case.
And refresh my memory, what kind of exercise were they doing?
So these were runners. So this was middle-aged runners who were avid runners. And the minimum criteria is to run at least 50 kilometers per week. They had to have a high enough VO2 max, so to be very high levels of fitness. They all happened to be very lean, normal body weight. And most of them, actually, I think all of them were competing in local or national tournaments for running.
Okay, and then take me into treatment and how quickly things changed.
So we did a randomized fashion. So individuals either went on a high or low carb diet in a randomized fashion. We controlled a bunch of variables to ensure that we were just looking at whether the diet induced changes were real. And the athletes went on a diet for 4 weeks. So they went on a diet for at least 4 weeks. That's very, very, very important, because a lot of studies that show changes, diet-induced changes, we see that a lot of those changes are still happening for the first 3 weeks. So we wanted to get to 4 weeks so we can see a lot of those changes get back to homeostasis or normalize. So we could actually test the effects of the diet on changes. So they went on one of the 2 diets initially, and then they took time off the diets for multiple weeks and then went on the other diet. So these athletes were doing this intervention for, roughly around 12 weeks. You have a familiarization, early testing, 4 weeks on a diet. You're taking at least a couple of weeks off the diet and then doing the other diet, okay, in a randomized fashion across the board. So same person. So we're controlling their genetics and environment as well. And when they went on the high carbohydrate diet, they, just like they did with the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, they had a registered dietitian monitoring them, giving them guidance, nutritional advice. All these are very consistent with sports nutrition guidelines. So is the very low carbohydrate diet consistent with many of the thought leaders of how you perform and fuel on a very low carbohydrate based diet. So we followed both those criteria, and they were monitored throughout. In fact, in the ketogenic diet, they were also monitored for ketone levels as a measure of compliance. And we also had continuous glucose monitors. So we were measuring how they were adhering to the diet. Right, so someone's on a ketogenic diet, but all of a sudden at 12 o'clock at night, you see a spike to 200. I don't know. Were you adhering to the diet? This is where questions may arise, and we try to come up with a rationale to make sure the athletes were actually adhering to the diet. But this is our way of actually confirming they were on the diet. So that's what the study looked like. Across both of these studies, though, the glucose levels that we were measuring was from continuous glucose monitoring. We also measured HbA1c, insulin levels, a bunch of other cardiometabolic biomarkers. But we really wanted to look at the continuous glucose monitor levels as a measure of metabolic health. And the reason we want to do that is because we know that things like HbA1c don't reliably change completely until around at least 2 months. And the study was 4 weeks on each diet. So we knew that a fasting blood glucose levels would be insufficient, because acute changes over 24 hours can change fasting glucose levels in exercise or even the meal you ate the night before. We didn't see much value in an oral glucose tolerance test here, because that's a whole nother laboratory visit and you have to control a bunch of environments the night before, just like with a fasting glucose test. So we chose a continuous glucose monitor because it allowed them to live their normal life, and we could capture their entire fasting glucose levels, not just at one single time point, but every 5 minutes, 288 times per day, and thousands of times over the entire study duration. It gave us way better resolution on what was happening with their glucose control, not just in the fasted state, but in their food dynamics, how they're responding to food, how high they went. And so we were able to look at their entire glucose control over the entire circadian clock. So from sun up to sundown.
Talk about their performance throughout.
So what we were monitoring is athletes were asked to adhere to a very strict activity protocol, because we wanted to control activity as a variable. A lot of studies that look at performance or diet-induced changes, they'll be changing their calories. They'll be changing their activity level. They'll be losing weight. Those are all things that are going to affect someone's metabolic state and or their performance, which is also something we're looking at in this study. And what we wanted to do at this stage was we said, okay, well, that's obviously huge confounders on these study outcomes, but we really wanted to test whether there was a macronutrient-induced change. If you just shift around the calories but keep the calories consistent, is that inducing an effect? Because that's something that really hadn't been answered very well in rigorous randomized controlled trials. So we controlled all of those variables. And luckily, we had a very adherent group of individuals. You don't often get that. And they'd stuck through this for over 10 weeks, start to finish. And what we wanted to do, and what was really impetus of this study, is we wanted to understand what happens when we take these athletes and we put them on these grueling assessments, a 1 mile time trial test or 6 by 800 meter sprints. Now, I don't mean they went and ran a mile. Like your audience, like, oh, I can run a mile. That's not grueling. No. I mean, run the fastest mile of your entire life. That's what we're asking you to do. Run a mile. So somewhere between 4 to 7 minutes, as fast as you possibly can. Most of the audience listening to this will not be able to even do this in sub 7 minutes. Okay. It's a grueling endeavor, because it's long enough to be impossible to ignore the pain, but you have to push extremely hard the entire time and grind that out. So it was a 1 mile time trial and a 6x800 meter sprints. And what we saw is, historically speaking, Jesse, we would expect that in these very intense forms of exercise, sprints, these 1 mile time trials, that you would be almost completely reliant on carbohydrates as a fuel source. But what we actually saw is that individuals who were on these very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets were performing exactly the same, in fact, non-significantly better than those on the high carbohydrate diet. The same athlete too, by the way. So the question was, are carbohydrates really essential to performance if we are doing an exercise bout that's intense enough to require, quote unquote, require carbohydrates? Well, obviously, it wasn't requiring carbohydrates, because when we actually measured the amount of fat and sugar, or what we're saying here is carbs, as energy, we saw that at these very high levels of exercise intensity, that fat made up the majority of fuel at over 85% of someone's VO2 max, so maximal aerobic capacity. Exercise textbooks, exercise guidelines would say that carbohydrates would be the predominant and or essential fuel during an exercise intensity that high. But what we observed is that individuals who adapted to a ketogenic diet for sufficient, so at least 4 weeks in duration, that they were able to observe that their ability to perform was equivalent to high carb, and they were able to fuel that predominantly with fat as a fuel. This fundamentally flipped the way that we looked at fueling athletes with these various diets. Because keep in mind, when we talk about these ketogenic diets, Jesse, a lot of times you'll hear this from the athletic community and say, well, that sounds great, but it's going to cause a negative effect on our performance. And we said, okay, well, that sounds interesting, but no one's really done a study that controlled all these variables and actually answered that direct question. So let's try it. And to our shock, they performed exactly the same, which means, wow, now I have a choice. Now the diet I choose isn't going to determine whether I perform better or not, but it may have metabolic health consequences. Because what we were seeing is that 30% of the athletes on the high carb diet were developing glucose levels consistent with prediabetes. And when they switched over to a ketogenic diet, all of those athletes resolved their glucose levels into normal range. They resolved their prediabetes, okay? But then we did a follow-on study, Jesse, because a lot of the feedback with that is like, oh, look, then these short duration, intense exercise bouts, yeah, okay, well, maybe during something that's short, it won't, fat's fine, okay? Even though before they didn't say it was fine. But now, like, okay, it's fine. But what about these Ironman type of events? What about these long duration aerobic exercise bouts? There's no way they'd perform the same if you need to oxidize carbohydrates throughout to maximally perform, and you need muscle glycogen to perform on these exercise bouts. So we did another study. We said, okay, that's a really good question. We haven't actually answered that question. We're going to recruit Ironman competitors. We're going to ask Ironman competitors to adhere to a diet for 6 weeks. We're going to do the same thing, put them on one diet in randomized fashion, control the same variables, cross them over to the other diet after time off of each diet. And let's see how they now do in a time to exhaustion trial. So we're going to ask them to do 70% of their VO2 max and sustain it for as long as humanly possible, until they could no longer go, until they hit the wall. They bonked. Okay. And so athletes were doing this. We had athletes go up to, some of them, over 4 hours. But what we found is, yet again, that when athletes reduced their carbohydrates to less than 50 grams per day, that they saw no deterioration in performance. Their performance was exactly the same on the ketogenic diet versus the high carbohydrate diet. This goes against so much of the sports nutrition guidelines and ideologies that push these super high volumes of carbohydrates as virtually essential to perform. And what we were seeing is that's not the case, even in Ironman competitors in long duration rides. And what we also observed is that we were looking at the advanced biomarkers that would predict changes in metabolism. We were looking at continuous glucose monitors and ketones. And what we were observing is that many of these circulating metabolites in response to a ketogenic diet would not reach normal homeostasis until after the 3-week time point. So around the 4-week time point. This is the same time point that we were talking about, Jesse, that was linked to performance normalization on the ketogenic diet. Because so many of these studies before were 3 weeks or less. They were looking at individual biomarkers of a ketone elevation or fat burning going up. Yes, that happens pretty quickly. But we know that circulating metabolites since the 1960s don't normalize on very low carbohydrate interventions for weeks. And what we saw for the very first time is that when we monitored the circulating brain metabolites in the form of ketones and glucose, that they came back up to normal after 4 weeks. So this then brought up the idea of, well, what was the key driver of performance outcomes? Well, we did one more thing with that experiment. We then gave the individuals just enough glucose after that to see if just trickling enough glucose, not to change glycogen levels, because you need a lot of glucose to do that, not enough glucose to change the entire landscape of how your body burns fat and carbs. Because when you consume a lot of carbs, your body starts shifting to burning a lot of carbs. What we did is we just trickled in enough glucose, 3.4 grams, well, actually, yeah, 3.4 grams every 20 minutes. So like a teaspoon of sugar every 20-minute window. So a tablespoon every hour, basically. So basically nothing. Like just basically go take a big teaspoon and put a little bit of sugar on it. That's what we're giving every hour. Not one of these Gatorades or gels or hell, some people are recommending that you consume 90 to 120 grams per hour, which is basically the equivalent of an entire loaf of bread. So imagine eating an entire loaf of bread every hour while you're exercising. And that's what some people are essentially recommending in carbohydrate content. But we just gave enough to trickle in to maintain blood glucose levels in the normal range. Because the thinking was, well, if all we're doing is not affecting the amount of carbohydrates that are being burned in the body and not enough to change muscle glycogen, what we're actually isolating out and determining is whether a change in maintaining normal blood glucose and ultimately brain energy could do. And we saw just giving 10 grams per hour, 6 to 9 times lower than current recommendations for carb intake, we saw like 22% improvement in performance. Now that was kind of mind-blowing because in that same experiment, we did this on both low and high carb diets. And they both saw improvements in performance because both developed hypoglycemia. But yet one diet, the ketogenic diet, had low carbohydrate content and was burning less carbs and more fat. So it wasn't the amount of fat or carbs they were burning because each diet had completely distinct levels of each they were burning, but that they performed the same. It wasn't the amount of muscle glycogen either because we know that ketogenic diets, at least in 4 weeks in duration, all studies with athletes have shown reduction in muscle glycogen, but they performed exactly the same. So it must not be the muscle glycogen. So what we had been doing over the last 5 years is we had been looking at what was the key determinant of exercise performance, because every time we would look at these studies in a rigorous randomized control fashion and ask these questions, we were coming up with answers that showed that the amount of carbohydrates someone was consuming was not predicting performance. And what I mean by that is when you had to give enough carbohydrates to change glycogen or carbohydrate oxidation levels, so how much sugar you burn, and muscle glycogen, or how much carbs you load up with to fill up your muscle before a race, did not seem to predict performance. But that's what everyone's recommending. That's what the sports nutrition guidelines recommend, 5 to 12 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per day. On top of athletes who are normal body weight, some males, that's over 1,000 carbohydrates per day. Over 1,000. Keep in mind, we saw levels at just on average 350, where middle-aged runners who were fit, normal body weight were developing prediabetes. 30% of them were at 350 grams on average per day. And some of these are pushing up to 1,000, okay? So that's astronomical. So we were looking back at all the data that said, well, where did this come from? Like, where's the data on this that shows that they're pushing this? Because it must be from somewhere. Well, we looked back in the literature and we were finding all the way back to the 1890s, the Olympians, all the way up to 1970, were essentially consuming fat and protein focused diets. You can look at the cafeteria records of Olympic athletes, the catering orders. It was a fat and protein heavy diet. But in the 1970s, there was a major shift in mindset. Well, in the 1960s, right before this, there was a famous physician called Jonas Bergstrom who developed a muscle biopsy technique called the Bergstrom muscle biopsy, where he put a needle in the muscle and pulled out muscle tissue and put it into a analysis and found that, oh, wow, look, there's glucose stored in this muscle tissue. It must be important to performance if it's stored in the muscle. Okay. So then they gave a ton of carbohydrates, found that more glucose was being stored in the muscle, and that more glucose being stored in the muscle was associated with longer performance. Then in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, a researcher called Collier, so Coyle, or Coyle, however you want to pronounce it, was discovering that there was this new technique emerge where you could actually measure the amount of oxygen being consumed, the amount of CO2 being expired, and that ratio would tell you how many carbs and fat they were burning. And what they were seeing is, wow, when they consume more carbohydrates, they burn more carbs, and the amount of carbs being burned was linked to better performance. Now, keep in mind, they never causally proved it. They were just showing associations. But then in the 1980s, there was a concept called the crossover effect that was developed and has been sitting in the exercise textbooks for the last 40 years, which showed that as you get higher and higher levels of intensity, that you rely more predominantly on carbohydrates as a fuel source. And that is 100% true, Jesse. That as you get higher, you rely more on carbohydrates. And that as you get higher in intensity, you can use less and less fat as fuel because it becomes more anaerobic. Think about someone sprinting. You can't really breathe if you're doing a max effort sprint. You can barely breathe, but you feel like you can't gasp for air. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. Now, that was prevailing belief for years. But again, these were all based on associations. Then in the 2017 through 2021, there was 3 separate studies by a very prominent group, Louise Burke's group and John Hawley's group, that showed that just comparing ketogenic diets to high carb diets. And what they saw is that these elite level Olympic race walkers who went on a ketogenic diet saw a reduction in performance. It was only 2%. So for most individuals, 2% is completely unnoticeable, but it made headlines all over because 2% can be the difference between first and second place in an Olympic athlete. But most of those studies actually didn't show inherently a performance decline. What they showed instead was a reduction in exercise efficiency. So in a measure of how much these athletes are actually able to perform over a set period of time. And what they were also showing is that they were showing these marginal reductions in performance. Now, keep in mind, those studies from 2017 to 2021, essentially, they said it in their own manuscript, put the nail in the coffin that carbohydrates were important for performance, that low carbohydrate diets would impair performance. However, those studies were 5 days to 3 weeks in duration. Not a single one of them ever actually went to 4 weeks in duration, despite knowing since the 1960s that key circulating metabolites for things like the brain don't normalize when you shift on a diet for at least over 3 weeks, so 4 weeks in duration. So we then conducted these randomized controlled trials. We were seeing that not only just us, but others were seeing that if you sustain the diet for sufficiently long, that you were no longer seeing these performance declines anymore. And this then led to this theory of, well, what is actually driving performance? And so we had actually pulled virtually every exercise study that ever administered carbohydrates and for over 100 years. So over 100 years of evidence, we looked at 600 different citations, over 160 different performance studies, took over 5 years. And when we looked at why carbohydrates were improving performance, what we saw is that when carbohydrates improve performance, Jesse, 88% of the time it did, it wasn't the carbohydrate group that had a massive change in their biomarkers. It was the placebo group or the non-carbohydrate group that was seeing a reduction in brain energy metabolites in the blood. They were seeing drops in blood glucose levels. Those studies back in the 1960s and 1970s by Bergstrom and Collier, they also showed a reduction in blood glucose levels, but they didn't blame it on the blood glucose levels. They blamed it on the amount of muscle or glucose in the muscle or the amount of carbohydrates the body burned, despite knowing that a drop in blood glucose levels has a certified, well-known mechanistic neuroendocrine counterregulatory response that impairs performance to preserve brain energy. And so what we were finding is that the overwhelming majority of time, it wasn't reliably that the carbohydrate or the amount of glycogen in the muscle predicted performance. It wasn't the amount of carbohydrates being burned that predicted performance. It was the amount of brain energy metabolites circulating in the blood present that was reliably predicting, or was the predominant primary predictor of performance, or if someone got early fatigue. And that fundamentally shift the way we think about this, because what it fundamentally showed for the first time to our knowledge is there's two distinct pools of glucose in the blood. There's the large glucose pool, which is the muscle, and there's a small glucose pool, which is the liver, which holds glucose as glycogen, and the circulation amount of glucose in the blood. Again, you only have about 5 grams of glucose circulating in the blood at any one moment. I mean, basically the equivalent of a teaspoon of glucose at any one moment. So it's a very small amount there that's present there. But yet, when that is reduced even marginally, you can see dramatic reductions in performance due to established neuroendocrine counterregulatory response to preserve and protect the brain. However, the large glucose pool is what's gotten almost all the attention because people focus on muscle glycogen or the amount of carbs the body burns. And as you pump your body full of carbohydrates at super high levels, the body fills up these large glucose pools. And people believe, well, obviously, if I just fill the muscle with more glucose, it's going to predict my performance. But yet it did not reliably predict performance. In fact, one of the best ways to tell this is they've done genetic manipulation of preclinical models, animal systems. And what they found is that individuals who basically have an overexpression or an overabundance of muscle glycogen, they don't perform better than those who don't. So you overload the muscle with glycogen, and these animals, artificially through a genetic manipulation, the best type of science someone could possibly do is genetically modify something as a single variable and determine if it has an effect. And they've done this, and it didn't improve performance. But if you actually overload the liver, so you genetically manipulate till you can fill the liver with glycogen, but not the muscle, that did improve performance. Again, through a genetic manipulation. So this is one of the cleanest ways to actually get at that question, but that's in preclinical models. And so they may say, okay, well, that's preclinical animal models. That doesn't apply to humans. But yet when we looked at 160 different performance studies, 88% of the time, it was this circulating amount of the small glucose pool, the amount in the blood and the liver, that was predicting performance. Whereas the large glucose pool as a distinct pool was not reliably predicting performance. And so that's really the impetus of a major paper that was just released in Endocrine Reviews recently, actually very recently, essentially showing this over 100 years of evidence, 600 citation, 160 different performance studies, and really a 5-year haul of effort to try to understand what was going on and what was actually predicting performance, and try to get clues as to why carbohydrates are manipulating metabolism and why they are manipulating performance. And also get at, is it this large glucose pool or is this small glucose pool? Because if it's the large glucose pool, then yes, the sports nutrition guidelines are right. You need to load up an abundance of carbohydrates. But if they're wrong, which our evidence shows that they are, then all you need is the amount of carbohydrates required to maintain the small glucose pool, which is infinitely lower. And as a result, athletes may start to ask some really important questions. If it's a small glucose pool that predicts performance, do I need to have these astronomical amounts of carbohydrates that the sports nutrition industry is telling me I need to have? Do I? Do I need to consume literally 120 grams of carbohydrates for 4 to 6 hours straight on my ride? Or do you need less than that? Because it's consistent with the small glucose pool that we reliably see as the strongest predictor of performance. Now, I also want to acknowledge here that the small glucose pool is not the only thing that predicts performance. Okay? We know that when athletes hit the wall, eventually, that even when you completely prevent hypoglycemia by giving sufficient amount of carbohydrates, they will essentially eventually hit fatigue. So just because you maintain normal glucose levels forever doesn't mean that you're going to prevent fatigue. There are other factors that are secondary to the small glucose pool that also affect performance. But the primary predictor of performance, particularly in these long duration efforts, like a over 2-hour ride of any type of strenuous activity, is the small glucose pool. And that's consistent with multiple meta-analyses, Jesse, that have looked at resistance exercise, where resistance exercise is more of an anaerobic-based exercise, and carbohydrates don't improve performance in that either until you get past 45 minutes in duration, and it needs to be a strenuous form of it. So typically like a leg-based resistance exercise. So again, all showing the same as that consistent phenomenon. But it makes total sense because when you actually understand how the body tries to protect itself, what's the most important tissue?
The brain.
The brain, without a doubt. When the brain senses low blood glucose levels, it does everything it can to shut down all the systems that will eat away and starve the brain from that glucose. And what does it do? It stops activity. Okay. Another key example of this is when ketones elevate and lactate elevate. Those are typically signs within the body that you're in a caloric deficit or a high energy expenditure state. And when those are present in the blood, the brain eats them preferentially over glucose. Even all the way down to the receptor, Jesse. The receptor for ketones and lactate allow for passive diffusion into tissues to be burned and utilized. Whereas glucose in many tissues requires active transport. It requires active transport in the form of insulin for glucose to get into the muscle. Why? Because it only is going to the muscle in abundance. It's not essential. It only goes there in abundance, right? Because insulin actually goes to the liver first to restore liver glycogen in the small glucose pool. Why would it go to the liver first, Jesse? Because it's protecting the most important tissue in the brain from being energy deprived. If the muscle was the most important tissue, then it would go there first. And guess what? It doesn't. 66 to 75% of insulin that's released from the pancreas goes through what they call the hepatic portal vein, straight to the liver, and it goes there first. And when it goes there first, it binds that tissue, and that eats the overwhelming amount of glucose. And it does it to protect you. It protects you from going into a brain energy deficit, which is critical to save your life. At least historically it would. Nowadays, you're like, oh, I'm just getting hypoglycemic. Let me go eat some orange juice. Well, guess what? Before there wasn't orange juice sitting on the sideline. Okay. So it did everything it could to protect you from that deficit. And all the mechanistic and physiologic rationale has been elucidated in this review that explains exactly why that is. But it's there as an evolutionary protective mechanism for the brain, which is why even small micro amounts of glucose are able to dramatically improve performance, equivalent to what we see in these other studies that give astronomical amounts of carbohydrates. It's also why, Jesse, when you look at dose response studies in exercise, where you give, let's say, 30, 60, or 90 grams of carbohydrates, you do not consistently see a performance improvement once you give some carbohydrates versus a lot more. Why is that? Well, if it was the large glucose pool that was important for more muscle glycogen and carbohydrate oxidation, then the more you gave, the better performance would be. But yet we don't consistently see that. Why is that? But we do see that if you give some carbohydrates versus none, so long as the exercise is sufficiently long to induce a drop in blood glucose, carbohydrates reliably improve performance. 88% of 160 different studies that have looked at this. So I'm off my soapbox. It took us 5 years to actually analyze that. And I hope the sports nutrition industry will pay attention to this, because what we're also seeing is that these heavy amounts of carbohydrates that are being pushed onto athletes is not for free. It's not for free. Some of these athletes are developing adverse metabolic changes. One of the most prominent examples is a gentleman who came out publicly. His name's Lionel Sanders, a world champion Ironman competitor. He went on to eventually develop, following the sports nutrition guidelines, super lean, exercising sometimes 4+ hours per day, prediabetes. He was fatigued, lethargic, wasn't recovering well, went to the doctor, got his blood work back. Everything looked good except for his glucose levels were going into the prediabetes range. So he had developed prediabetes. He changed his diet, reduced these ultra-processed forms of carbohydrates in his diet. Boom. Almost immediately, his glucose went to normal. He went on to win an Ironman championship. So the point here is that this review, through a number of our work and 100 years of evidence, is essentially showing for the first time ever that there's these two distinct forms of glucose pools with very important, distinct effects on the body. One with a clearly more important role in the body regulating performance, but also preserving your brain energy and your brain's metabolism. And as a result, it also has impacts in performance. And we see that. It makes sense that the brain would drive performance. It isn't all about the muscle, Jesse. A lot of performance, physical performance, is also about the brain.
All right, that was fascinating. Very detailed. My question to you after all that, from the research you did, research you looked at, for the athlete out there wanting to get practical with this, distill it down in the most general sense.
So athletes that are doing over 60 minutes of strenuous exercise, whether it be aerobic or anaerobic exercise, they can benefit from carbohydrates. It's a tool, but the amount of carbohydrates you probably need is much lower than you've probably been told. We see that even just as little as 10 grams is sufficient to potentially do this, maybe up to 30. Excess amounts beyond that may not have any additional benefit. Now, if it's less than 60 minutes in duration, it doesn't seem to have much of a performance impact for these athletes. And that's the practical advice at the event itself, at the training session itself. But don't negate your actual diet that you're consuming over the 24 hours of the day. Every study that has looked at these effects has done so while controlling these key dietary factors, activity factors, etc. So if your diet's all messed up and you have to consume, like, let me give you a perfect example. On these Peloton rides, these Tour de France rides, where they're doing 4 to 7+ hours on back-to-back days, they're pushing 120 to 200 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And people will point to that as an example and say, hey, look at these guys. They're the best in the world. They're doing, 120 to 200. Well, yeah, guess what? They're on a bike for 4 to 7 hours every single day. And they need to consume astronomical amounts of calories. When are they going to consume them? Some of them have to be on a bike. That's the most extreme example of all time, where they're actually consuming their diet on a bike. Whereas in these other examples where people are going into exercise for different bouts and they're not doing it for back-to-back days, like a Tour de France ride, which is the most extreme thing there probably is in athletic performance, they're preparing for an individual event, a marathon, right? Or an individual, like a 5K, a 10K, a cycle ride, a performance bout. Maybe there's an athlete, they have a football game, they have soccer, or any of these one things. They're not going for multiple days back to back. They're doing an individual performance bout, and then they have time to eat and recover outside of that. And that's where the overwhelming majority of their diet and calories come from. Again, these exceptions like the Tour de France are not the same thing we're talking about here. Those athletes, by default, logistically speaking, have to consume calories during their ride. But what those athletes do should not be what everyone else is doing, okay? They're literally doing the most extreme sport of all time. And so that's an inherently different scenario. I can't tell you the amount of times I've heard this. But either way, for the average person who's listening to this, who isn't a Tour de France Peloton rider, okay, what should you do? If it's less than 60 minutes in duration, carbohydrates don't seem to reliably improve performance. If it's over 60 minutes in duration, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic exercise, so resistance training, running, jiu-jitsu, whatever, yes, all those things can improve with precise amounts of carbohydrates, but probably a lot less than sports nutrition guidelines recommend, assuming you're getting sufficient calories on a well-formulated background diet that you consume outside of your training window.
All right, last question for today. What can we take from the research, apply to the average person who's not an athlete, just looking at the physiology, somebody that just wants to lose weight and get metabolically healthy?
I'm going to give you the 3 free tips anyone could have to try to improve their health. Okay. And these, again, like simple tips that work for everyone. And by the way, they're all free. No one's making money off this. This is just what works. Number 1, athletes should eat whole foods. Okay. Athletes, not athletes, but anyone out there should be focused on whole foods. You probably don't want to consume your food in packaged format. You probably don't want to consume liquid calories. You want to focus on whole foods as a set precedence. That's going to eliminate so many of these food components and ingredients that drive hunger through the roof, that makes it easy to overconsume calories that are micronutrient deficient. Eat whole foods from your diet, regardless of the diet. Okay. If you want some added extra benefit, sure, you could get the additional benefits of things like nutritional ketosis by lowering your carbohydrates specifically, but focus on eating whole foods and reducing calories in liquid format. Number 2, exercise. Okay. Any type of physical activity is better than no activity. So move. Try to do, if you don't move right now, do a 30-minute walk. That's it. Just a 30-minute walk every single day. If you can do that, do more. So any activity is better than no activity. More activity is better than some activity. And if you want to get very prescriptive and precise, then you could start talking about a specific amount of resistance exercise training days per week, at least 3, maybe upwards of 5, and aerobic exercise bouts, which they recommend anywhere between around the same amount per week. But the more you do of it, the better it is. And there's usually a pretty clear dose response of exercise. The more you do, the healthier you are across multiple biomarkers, the more you reduce your risk for most major diseases and mortality. All right, that's number 2. Doesn't cost you anything. You can go outside and walk right now. You can go run right now. You can do push-ups on the ground. You can do, or on the counter, on the wall. You can start somewhere, right? Body weight exercises and walking. It doesn't cost you any money, nor does diet, by the way, because you have to go spend money in the grocery store. It's about making a choice on what you consume. It's not about buying expensive food. It's about changing the choice you make in the grocery store. Not about buying new things or expensive things. It's about changing what you buy. All right. And the third thing is free is sleep. If people really want to prioritize their health, that's the third pillar. And how do you do that? And how do you do it for free? You wake up in the morning and you get sunlight in the morning. Now, this is something that people talk about all the time. It's so trendy now. We've known this for so long that if you just wake up and get sunlight, that's going to set your circadian clock. It's going to help you go to sleep on time later in the day. Then when you get towards the end of the day, you want to reduce the amount of artificial light exposure you get so that you are more likely to fall asleep and feel rested. So it's about getting the right amount of sleep and the right quality of sleep. You getting sunlight in the first thing in the morning doesn't cost you a dime. You not looking at screens or TV right before bed doesn't cost you a dime. Those are the three pillars of health. Well-formulated nutrition from whole foods, reducing liquid calories. Exercise, more is better than less. And sleep. Focus on the free things, getting out sunlight and reducing artificial light late at night. And by exercising, you reduce inflammation. You're able to sleep better. When you get better sleep, you're able to make better choices with your nutrition because you're less impulsive and you're less inclined to overeat poor food choices. All these things interact with each other. If you avoid one, other things start to crumble. So focus on those three things. Those are the priorities. Nothing about it's fancy, and it works every time.
Love it. Great tips there. Coming back to that 100 years of research, though, anything specific that we can pull from there and apply to the average person?
Well, I think the message is pretty clear that you don't need to have an abundance of carbohydrates to function. You know, you can function on, I mean, this evidence is just more reinforcement that people can choose the diet of their choice in a well-formulated format and function. Hell, if elite athletes or like high-level athletes can choose what diet they need and perform the same, then certainly an individual who's not worried about their race time can do the same. Okay, and so this idea of anything is essential is the thing you should be focusing on is ensuring you get adequate protein, essential nutrients in the form of fat, and the rest of the calories can be made up with ideally whole food nutritious components of your choice. So, but there's a lot of things that come out of this article. The practical take homes for the average person are really, there's so many things that we had to go through in this article, Jesse. I mean, we went through 16 different points, knowing full well when we were seeing this evidence and having to review all this data and what we were finding that we needed to address every single stone and turn it upside down. What we were essentially seeing is that, one thing that we also found here, which is also applicable to, it is an athlete specific thing, but I think it can apply to other people, is that, and this kind of gets to like food labeling and food packaging and what people's choices they make in the grocery store is, a lot of the recommendations that athletes are given from like, let's say sports nutrition industry. Let's say you go to the grocery store and you look at the front of a package and it says 0 sugar, keto friendly. And you're thinking, this must be healthy. Well, not necessarily, right? Because the same thing has been applied in the sports nutrition world where they said, have this drink, it's going to help you perform better. And like Gatorade's in the front of some of the healthiest people in the world. And it makes you look like, oh man, they're doing these really important forms of exercise and they're super healthy and they're functioning great with this Gatorade, right? Not hating on Gatorade. There's a ton of companies that do sugar water and gels and crap. But either way, what we're finding is that when these athletes consume these prior to exercise at very high levels, they actually spike insulin. They block fat oxidation. They accelerate muscle glycogen breakdown. The sports nutrition industry has said that, you consume these to prevent muscle glycogen breakdown. Spare it. No, you actually break it down faster when you exercise with consuming these things. Okay. Yes, you can resynthesize it afterwards with high amounts of carbohydrates, but you actually break it down faster. So one other theme that comes out of this is just you have to be your own advocate. Okay. You have to be your own advocate for what works for you, and try to avoid putting trust into things like food companies or sports nutrition industries and other places to quote unquote give you the best guidance and advice. You have to look for the trusted resources, look for examples of what worked, and follow or take the information that you're seeing as helpful in those examples and apply it to your own life. But if people are interested in learning more about that, it's a pretty extensive article. We summarize everything in the first 16 points in the first introduction, so people can't read the whole thing. We try to make it easier for them. We also put out a lot of content to help explain these things. They can find the article at Endocrine Reviews. And I also, on my Instagram page and Twitter page, or X, whatever you want to call it, have tried to break down a lot of the key variables in association with this article. And you can also find the article there as well. So if people want to hear out more, they can check out those places.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I was a fat kid growing up. I had obesity as a kid. I failed for over half a decade on all these various diet strategies, and I eventually found success with reliably and sustainably changing my diet.